long has she had this, do you know?
I'm going to guess about 10 years, maybe more. It's a plant that would normally bloom in the springtime, or early spring, late winter.
Uh-huh.
And because Margaret grows in the basement, her seasons get thrown off just a little bit. So while normally it would bloom during our show time, for her it tends to bloom more in December when there's nothing going on. So she never gets to bring it to a show or anything. It's just somewhat frustrating. Alright, so one of the first things I want to do is to clip off some of that dead stuff.
And do you use new scissors every time when you're working with a new plant?
In this case, I'm using brand new scissors.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, I have about maybe 30 or 40 pair of these, and I sterilize them in large groups, and then when they run out of clean snips, I sterilize them all again.
And what type of orchid was this again?
This is a chysis.
Chysis.
C-H-Y-S-I-S. And I believe the species is Bractescens. But again, I haven't found the label on it.
And it kind of just like branches off of itself when it grows?
Yeah, it's an interesting plant the way it grows. It has the rhizome-like growth, but it's almost like a keiki. Instead of being tight at the base, it just keeps sort of lengthening out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it can become unmanageable over time.
And is it naturally like a pendulous growing?
Yeah.
Okay. Pendulous.
And it blooms as it's putting out the new growth. So what I'm cutting off right now are last year's bloom stems.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the new growth getting started here, and you'll see it's swollen right here, and that's where the flower buds are going to come out from. And it blooms with a nice round flower about the size of a 50-cent piece or a little larger. A full round petals. Looks a little bit like a Vanda flower.
Oh, nice.
But they're very fragrant, and it's an off-white color.
This is the best time when you're like, getting everything cleaned up with the bugs and any nastiness.
And this plant, I haven't seen any bugs on it.
Yeah.
But I did spray it once or twice. And this black is sunburned from having been inside all winter and then going outside on a really bright sunny day when the UV index was too high. So one of the things that I noticed here is that the roots all have this white coating on them.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these roots are dead, and that white coating is the minerals from our water, and it gets concentrated enough that it actually kills the root.
Okay.
So part of the problem Margaret's been having is that these new parts of the plant can't get roots all the way up here into the potting mix before they succumb to the poor water quality.
Yeah.
So by cleaning this all up, moving it up where these new growths can get roots into the potting mix, the plant should start to recover. But that's why clean water is so important, is these minerals calcify on the roots and kill the roots.
Oh, well, that's just easy.
It's an old basket, fortunately.
Some of that muscle.
That's what is left. Okay. I'm not seeing a whole lot of live root in here. I think we also have a piece of cork that it was originally mounted to.
Buried treasures.
It's the orchid archaeologist here. Yeah, there just aren't a lot of roots, so we're just gonna sort of have to stare here. Alright, so the next thing is we just want to find out where's good division spots. So I'm going to try to sort of unbraid it a little bit.
A lot of the time it'll like naturally
There we go.
kind of find a way, right?
Sort of one growth section here. Okay. Nobody said it was pretty.
Want me to pull on one side?
I think we're going to have to cut.
Cut? Okay. Do you try to avoid cutting when you're dividing?
I do, and this is going to sound sort of crazy, but if for any of you cooks in the crowd, you know that when you tear lettuce, that the lettuce divides on the edges of cell membranes and it doesn't brown, whereas when you cut it with a knife, it browns. That's why these are only 99 cents. So when I cut into the tissue, I'm really cutting straight across the cells and leaving areas open for infection.
Okay.
When you tear, while the cut may be, the wound may be bigger, it's easier for the plant to heal over.
So it's like in nature if it were to divide itself.
Yeah. That's sort of a natural division right there. So we're just going to tear it. Maybe. Should have had my Wheaties this morning.
And when you're dividing something like this, what's like a good point to make sure each of them have like a new growth, or how many bulbs?
What I'm looking for first is, yes, you always want to make sure you have multiple mature growths on either side of where you're breaking the rhizome. This plant, because of the way it grows, it's pretty easy to see where those divisions are. But then I'm also making sure that on those growths that there are some new front leads. So we've got one started here. There will be other ones coming along, probably on some of these other growths after we do the division.
Kind of kick-started it to think it needs to...
Yeah, a lot of times a little stress to the plant, yeah, sort of reinvigorates it. It says, oh my God, my tree fell over. I need to do something. I can't just sit here anymore. Yeah, this is just too much stuff up here, so you're going to get rid of it. And 99% of it is dead. I don't see any live roots going through there.
Yeah.
So it was nice for holding moisture, but it wasn't really doing anything. And I'm just separating it out here again, just trying to get rid of as much of the dead stuff as we can. I'm not one of those people that worries excessively about old material. No matter how much I clean this up, there's always going to be bacteria and fungus in here. But I don't want to have so much that it overwhelms my new potting mix and causes it to rot.
Mm-hmm.
So we try to get rid of as much of the old junk as we can. And I think we've about accomplished what we can get there. Okay, so we got one division.
Yay!
Breaking up, Scotty. You can see that was an old break, so good riddance. Now, a lot of times with a lot of this kind of orchid, if you'll take this when it's a fresher break,
Mm-hmm.
this is so dehydrated I don't think it'll work with this one, but if you laid that on sphagnum moss, a lot of times it would send up a new growth from one of these dormant eyes and form a whole new plant.
Kind of like the nobly dendrobiums
Like
do
the
that.
nobles and the catasetums will do that.
I call them hats when they get little hats.
Yeah.
My I have shoot, what is it? A Lycaste that was dying back, and this year it just sent up little hats on itself, and I think it's gonna die, but you know.
Yeah, and the weird thing is those guys will sometimes form their new little
Yeah.
baby from right at the very tip of the bulb.
Yeah. So I'm like, well, there's still hope. I brought it inside. I was just gonna leave it outside of my bad orchid group, but it came inside.
Okay, so this is sort of one division, but it's going to be too big to actually get in a pot.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take the two back bulbs and cut them off and make it just a little bit more manageable sized plant. And this is where the few roots that are really in good shape are right here anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good division. This we can put in a pot and it will probably send up a new growth of its own.
Because it's more plump than the other one?
Right. It has the storage capacity and the water to get it through the crisis until it can get some new growth.
Mm-hmm. The last one was like, no.
Yeah, it's in there. Alright, I think that's a good sized chunk that we can pot up in a way that will make it present a little more openly.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can get the potting mix up to about here, the older parts of the plant here should set out some good roots into the new potting mix. You saw Margaret had it in a wooden basket. I don't have any wooden basket, so I use the plastic ones, which either beneficially or sadly do not rot and break down, so next repotting is going to be a little more challenging. So, by spacing the plant out a little bit and giving it more room, the idea is that hopefully some of these older growths may put out some new growth of their own. It may or may not work, but the quicker access we can get to the roots to be into the potting mix, the better this plant will do. And it's a plant that likes a lot of water, so I'm actually just going to use sphagnum moss on this. This is long fibered New Zealand sphagnum moss, shipped all the way in here, containers. New Zealand, and it's really hard to get right now because during the beginning of the COVID thing, all the sphagnum pickers got put out of work.
Oh, jeez. And another thing, people, like you were saying, like a lot of people worry too much about cleaning up all the dead and all that other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Having a little bit of the roots, even if they're dead or not, is a really good way to like anchor the plant in.
Right. If you clip off every single dead root, sometimes there's nothing left to hold the plant in place. And it's important that the plant doesn't jiggle back and forth in its new pot, because can you put a hand there for a second? If it jiggles around too much while those new roots are growing, the new roots will actually break off before they get long enough to do anything. Putting just a few stakes in here to hold those growths in place, so that the plant doesn't wobble around too much. Now, a lot of people would not put sphagnum over the rhizome, but again, that's my enticement for the plant to put out a new growth of roots right into the potting mix, and then get them down into that basket real quickly. Because this plant likes a lot of water, its roots are just not adapted to being out in the open like a cattleya root, and they'll dry up and die before they actually get into the potting mix. Okay, that looks pretty good. And it's not quite stable, which is perfect. Because this should actually hang off to the side like this as a grown plant.
That's a lot more attractive too than when it was first brought into you. And
Being open like this, it will give it a lot more room to fill in.
And airflow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Better airflow, less problems on the leaves and roots. Okay, so there's one.
Beautiful. Now, when you're in the belief of, like, everyone has, like, their repotting strategies, are you a wet, like, I know moss usually has to be moist to, you know, go in, but, like, if you're working with, like, another orchid, like a cattleya, that would be like a bark mix, do you wet your bark beforehand or after?
You know, everybody does it differently. I don't know if our folks here remember Bill Porter, but he used to come to our show. He ran Porter's Orchids up in Michigan, and he had a great way of doing it, which was to take his bark and he'd put it in a great big trash pail, you know, the big rubber trash pails, and he would soak it in a fertilizer mix, in his water fertilizer mix, and then he'd add just a little bit of detergent, a teaspoon of detergent, which breaks the water tension, and it allows the water to get into the bark more quickly and really penetrate the bark. So he repotted with wet bark. Me, I find, for me, the potting mix packs in better if it's dry. It doesn't tend to stick to itself as much, so I can get it to form a tighter mass around the roots. And so I do it with a dry mix, and then I water right away to wash all the fines out of the mix. So everybody does it different. There's no real right or wrong way. I suspect in theory that if you soak it first, then you can actually keep your plant dry for a period of time, which would encourage the new roots to grow.
I forget who told me, when they're repotting stuff sometimes, well, for stuff that's not water loving, they let it callus over, like if something were to have, like if, you know, you're dividing it or something, that way it kind of might relieve some of the stress on the plant from getting like something in the wound.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have plants that you can let all the wounded tissue really dry, you greatly minimize the risk of any kind of an infection getting into the plant. Let me go get 2 more baskets.
Okay.
So we can see if we can get it into a smaller basket, and I'm thinking the answer is probably no.
little root seed.
Yeah, it's just starting to grow some new roots, which is
So it's perfect
why I
timing.
think this is the best time we could do this one.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't able to make it before then.
Yeah. Everything works out for a reason. Although having a flood in your house is probably not the reason you wanted.
Oh, yes, it was definitely not. Like the last time I went into it, it was like up to my shins, and I was like, my knees. I was like, oh, it's not that bad. Mike was like, no, Anna, it was 44 inches of water. I was like, oh.
Thank God it was clean water.
Yeah. Want me to hold it?
No, I think
Okay.
I got it.
It's behaving.
So, again, we can see a new growth started here, and I think there's another one right.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
right there. So we wanna try to get these just over the potting mix so that as the roots are going to emerge from the old pseudobulb right behind where the new growth is. And we want to make sure that those areas are sort of in contact with the sphagnum moss. Now, a lot of people feel that sphagnum moss breaks down too quickly, and that it has to be repotted every year. I don't find that to be the case. If you use good quality sphagnum moss, it will last for quite a few years. The outside surface will oxidize and look awful, but inside it still stays quite fresh. So a lot of times when you take these things out for a summer vacation, you can spray them with the garden hose and literally wash off all the really fine loose stuff, and then pack a little bit of new in on top of it, and your plant's just fine without having to do major surgery to get it repotted. Again, we just want to make sure that this stays up over the sphagnum moss, so I'm putting one stake in just to keep it tight there. And then whoever gets these plants, if they want to clean up all the old sheaths off of the pseudobulbs, feel free. It'll make your plant look a little bit better, and you should do that before you would bring it into a show for the for our show for the display, or bringing it in for the show table. You want to clean it up and make it look as good as possible. So you can do that when you receive the plant if you're the lucky recipients. Alright, so out of the one big plant, we now have 4 big plants. It's a real space saver.
Alright. Well, thank you, Edgar.
Alright, and then just for fun, we'll take these guys and slip them all into the same pot to see if we get any new growth out of any of that.
Orchid experiments.
Being a true orchid lover, we hate to throw anything away. There's always hope. As long as it's green, there's always hope.
So true.
And you'll notice I've kept the 2 wounded cuts up where they're exposed so that I don't get an infection started in there. I don't want to bury those wounded parts on these old parts if I can avoid it. There we go. It's just as top heavy as the old plant. So we just need to make up 5 plant tags that say Chisis, probably Brachyescens, so we'll put Chisis Brachyescens ? And Margaret can fill us in with that later on, I'm sure.
Yes. Alright. Awesome job.